They said, "It's just for one night, Mom. The guest room is full." But the basement had no windows. Those words have haunted me ever since that night when my daughter put me down in a place no one should ever be put. I remember her voice, calm, almost too calm, like she was reading from a script designed to soothe a child, not her own mother, a woman who had carried her through childhood and tried to hold our family together when it threatened to fall apart. I am 81 now. I live alone in a small apartment filled with books, a few plants, and a chair by the window where the morning light falls softly on the floor. It's a quiet place, peaceful compared to that dark basement where I was trapped, forgotten and silenced, or maybe just hidden away like something inconvenient. The memories don't come in sharp flashes, but as a slow, sinking weight that presses down on my chest whenever I think of that night. It was supposed to be temporary, a just one-night arrangement, while my daughter and her family sorted out the chaos of their crowded house, a way to keep me close but out of the way. But closeness in a place with no windows feels more like imprisonment than care. I had come to their home after a small surgery, hoping for comfort, support, maybe even a little tenderness. Instead, I found myself walking down narrow stairs into a cold, unfinished room, lit only by a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, the walls bare and rough, the floor concrete and unforgiving. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a threadbare blanket that smelled faintly of damp and dust, and a portable heater that buzzed quietly in the corner. The door had a lock, though it was never fully closed, and there was no phone down there, no way to call out except the small, frail voice I managed to whisper into the thin air when no one was listening. Before that night, I had believed that family meant safety, that being a mother and grandmother gave me a place of respect and belonging. But that night shattered those beliefs into pieces too small to gather again. The house was bustling upstairs, laughter from the children, the clatter of dishes, the hum of televisions and radios. But down in the basement, there was only silence except for my own breathing and the occasional creak of the old house settling around me. I remember the way the cold seeped through my clothes and made my joints ache, how the silence wrapped around me like a shroud heavier than the blanket I had. I tried not to cry because I was tired of fighting, tired of being invisible, tired of the steady erosion of my dignity. I was a woman who had once taught others to read, who had baked birthday cakes and mended scraped knees, who had poured years of love into raising children and grandchildren. And now I was a shadow crouching in a basement, forgotten as if I had no history, no voice, no right to be. The night stretched on endlessly. I heard footsteps on the stairs and voices passing by the door, but no one stopped to check on me. I had to learn how to live without being seen. I clutched my arms around myself, imagining the sky outside, the soft rustle of leaves I used to watch in my garden, the warmth of sunlight on my face that felt like a distant memory. The promise that it was just one night felt like a cruel joke. Hours turned into days. The food was left outside the door on a tray, cold and unappetizing, the water in a plastic jug without a glass. I was not allowed to use the family bathroom upstairs. I had to make do with a small basin and a damp cloth. The television downstairs didn't work, and the only light came from that weak bulb that flickered and buzzed like a dying insect. I felt the walls closing in, the silence growing heavier, a suffocating presence pressing on me from all sides. At times, I whispered into the darkness, calling the names of my children, hoping for a crack in the walls that would let their voices through, but the silence answered only with emptiness. The basement became my prison, a place where I was not a mother, not a grandmother, but just a forgotten body taking up space. I remember moments of sheer disbelief, wondering if I had somehow become invisible, erased from the world by the very people who were supposed to love me. I wondered if this was what loneliness truly meant, not just being alone, but being unseen and unheard in a crowded house filled with life. Sometimes I thought about calling for help, but the phone was out of reach and my legs were too weak from the surgery to climb back upstairs. The door had no handle on the inside, only a latch that couldn't be opened from within. I was trapped not by chains, but by indifference. Days blurred together. I lost track of time, of the sun rising and setting. My mind wandered back to the life I once had. The kitchen where I baked pies, the garden I tended, the soft voices of grandchildren gathered around my lap. But those memories felt like stories from another person, someone distant and unreachable. The cold was relentless, seeping into my bones, making every breath a struggle. My medications were forgotten upstairs, and I felt the ache of missed doses, the slow unraveling of health that only added to my sense of abandonment. I was left to fend for myself in a place not meant for a living soul. The isolation was more than physical. It was a deep wound that cut through my spirit, a betrayal so profound that it echoed in every silent moment. I wasn't just alone, I was discarded. Then came the night when the pain in my chest became unbearable, when the air seemed too thin, and my vision blurred at the edges. I tried to call out, but my voice was weak and the walls swallowed it whole. Desperation surged through me, a fierce, raw need to be seen, to be saved. Somehow, gathering every ounce of strength left, I reached for the phone on the shelf upstairs, the one I had forgotten to unplug. I managed to press the buttons, trembling, barely able to speak, and finally got through to the fire department. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, asking questions I barely heard. The moments that followed felt both like an eternity and a relief. Footsteps pounding down the stairs, the door finally opening wide, the flood of light spilling into my dark prison. The firefighters' faces were kind, but filled with surprise and sadness. I was saved, yes, but also exposed. My family's betrayal now out in the open for the neighbors to see, the social workers to investigate. After the rescue, I was taken to a hospital where they cared for me, asked gentle questions, and helped me understand that what had happened was not my fault. It was a breaking point, but also a beginning. From that night on, my life changed in ways I had never imagined. I left the house that no longer felt like home and began the slow, painful process of reclaiming myself. I found strength in unexpected places, in the kindness of strangers, in the quiet moments of solitude, and in the fierce determination not to be invisible again. Now, years later, I tell this story not to seek pity or blame, but to remind anyone who feels discarded or unseen that their voice still matters, that even in the darkest basements of our lives, there is a door waiting to be opened. And sometimes we have to be the ones to call the fire department, to ask for help, and to step back into the light, even when the night seems endless. The moment I realized something was terribly wrong did not come with a shout or a slam of a door, but with a quiet, almost casual dismissal that cut through me sharper than any raised voice could have. It was a weekday afternoon, and I had been at my daughter's house for a little over 24 hours. The surgery I had undergone was minor, or so the doctors said, but I was still fragile and in need of rest and care. My daughter had insisted that I stay with her while I recovered, assuring me that their home was always open and that I would be treated like the mother I had been for all these years. I believed her because I had no reason not to. I thought that family meant a refuge, a place where wounds could heal and love could be tender and steady. Instead, I found myself locked away in the basement, alone with my fears and a thin blanket that did nothing to keep out the cold. The day had started like any other. I was trying to adjust to the strange feeling of being cared for rather than caring for others, and the quiet sounds of life upstairs, children laughing, the clinking of dishes, the low murmur of conversation, felt oddly distant, like I was watching from behind a thick glass wall. I tried not to let the isolation creep under my skin, telling myself it was only temporary, just one night, as my daughter had said. But hours passed, and the promises of morning were replaced by the harsh silence of afternoon and then evening. It was when I heard the soft footsteps above me, careful, almost hesitant, and the door to the basement creaked open, that the true betrayal began. My daughter stood in the doorway, her face neutral, her eyes avoiding mine, as if she were uncomfortable in her own skin. She spoke quietly, as if afraid the walls might overhear what she was about to say. "Mom, it's just for one night, really. The guest room is full, and the children need their space." I nodded, swallowing the lump that formed in my throat, trying to keep my voice steady when I said, "I understand." But her next words felt like the weight of a stone dropped into my chest. "You'll be fine down here, won't you? It's warm enough, and I'll bring you whatever you need." It was not a question. It was an order disguised as concern. I tried to smile, but the smile faltered. The basement was a world apart, cold, windowless, and smelling faintly of mildew and forgotten things. The light bulb overhead flickered, casting shadows that danced mockingly on the cracked concrete walls. The mattress was thin and lumpy, the blanket old and threadbare. There was no phone, no clock, nothing to mark the passage of time except the distant sounds of a family living above me, a family I was suddenly no longer a part of. That night I lay awake, listening to the house breathing around me, feeling the sting of tears I refused to shed. The next morning the routine was the same. Food was left outside the basement door, sometimes hot, often cold, and never with the warmth that made a meal more than just nourishment. Water came in a plastic jug with a paper cup, and I learned to make do with what I had. I tried to tell myself this was temporary, that soon I would be upstairs again, surrounded by the voices and laughter that were the soundtrack of my life. But deep down, I felt the sharp edge of exclusion cutting deeper with each passing hour. My daughter visited briefly, bringing folded clothes and a few medications, but her eyes rarely met mine. There was an unspoken distance that neither of us dared to bridge. When I asked if I could sit in the living room, she told me the children were napping and that it was better if I stayed downstairs. The phrase, "just for one night," echoed in my mind like a broken record, repeating endlessly while the days slipped by. On the third day, the pain began to seep in, not just the physical discomfort from my surgery and the damp cold of the basement, but a deeper ache that settled in my chest and made it hard to breathe. I tried to call for help, but the phone was unreachable, and my voice was too weak to carry far. I realized then that this was no accident, no oversight. I had been deliberately hidden away, pushed to the margins of a life that once revolved around me. The weight of that realization crushed me. I thought of the years I had poured into my family, the meals cooked, the scraped knees kissed, the school plays attended, the holidays celebrated, and how suddenly all of it felt invisible, as if erased by a single decision. One afternoon, a knock came at the basement door. It was my daughter's voice, softer than usual. "Mom, can you come upstairs? We need to talk." I struggled to stand, the pain shooting through my legs, and when I finally reached the top of the stairs, I found myself face to face with a woman I barely recognized. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her voice trembled slightly as she explained that the house was crowded, that the children needed their space, and that I was safer and more comfortable downstairs. I wanted to argue to remind her of the mother I had been, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, swallowing the sting of rejection. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed in the basement, staring into the dark corners that seemed to close in on me. The silence was suffocating. I thought of calling someone, anyone, but I was afraid of what they might say, afraid of being a burden, afraid of what it would mean if I spoke up. Then a sharp pain in my chest made me gasp for air. I stumbled toward the stairs, my fingers tracing the rough walls for support. Reaching the landing, I collapsed, tears streaming down my face. And finally, I found the courage to pick up the phone and dial the emergency number myself. The minutes that followed felt like a lifetime. When the door to the basement finally opened and the light spilled in, it was like stepping out of a tomb. The faces of the firefighters were gentle but resolute, their questions kind but urgent. I told them everything: the loneliness, the cold, the fear, the silence that had become my prison. They listened without judgment, their presence a balm to the wounds I could not yet name. News of the rescue spread quickly through the neighborhood, whispers and concerned glances following me wherever I went. My daughter's expression when she saw the flashing lights was a mixture of shame and anger, but I no longer cared what she thought. For the first time in days, I felt seen. The betrayal was raw and painful, but it was also the spark that ignited a fire within me, a determination to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my voice. That night marked a turning point. The basement was no longer a place I was trapped in, but a memory I was beginning to overcome. I realized that sometimes the greatest acts of love we owe ourselves are the hardest to give. That asking for help is not weakness, but courage. And that even when the people we love fail us, there is always a way back to the light. After that night, when I finally escaped the basement, aided by strangers who had no reason to care but somehow did, I thought my troubles would begin to ease, that the cold weight of loneliness and neglect would slowly lift, allowing me to find peace once more. But the truth was far more complicated, far more insidious in the way it unfolded. The rescue did not magically heal the wounds, nor did it restore the place in my family that had quietly slipped away long before the basement door had slammed behind me. Instead, I found myself in a liminal space, caught between the life I had known and the one I had to forge anew, walking a tightrope suspended between despair and hope. When the social workers came to talk to me at the hospital, their faces kind but clinical, I explained as best I could what had happened. I told them about the cold, the silence, the loneliness, and how my own daughter had locked me away as if I were some burden to be hidden from the world. They listened carefully, nodding and taking notes, promising me that things would change, that I would not be abandoned again. But promises, I would learn, are often fragile things, easily broken by the weight of human fear and selfishness. After a few days in the hospital, I was discharged into the care of a local assisted living facility, a place with clean rooms, steady meals, and people who smiled and asked my name without expectation. It was a strange kind of sanctuary, not my home, not my family, but a place where I was not invisible. I found comfort in the routines there, the slow rhythm of days marked by visits from nurses, shared meals with other residents, and quiet moments by the window watching the world go by. Yet, even in that relative safety, my heart ached for the family I had lost, for the home that had become a prison, and for the daughter who had turned away from me. Calls and letters from my daughter became infrequent and cold. Her voice, when I heard it was clipped and distant, filled with a mixture of guilt and resentment that I could neither unravel nor reconcile. It was as if she could not fully admit what had happened, but also could not forget it. My grandchildren asked questions I could not answer, their confusion and sadness a sharp reminder of the fractures in our family. I realized then that the basement was only the beginning, a physical manifestation of a deeper rift that had been growing quietly for years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the neglect and dismissal seeped into other areas of my life. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming, replaced by vague apologies about schedules and other commitments. Birthdays passed without cards or calls. The holidays were marked by silence, as if my absence was easier to bear than my presence. Each slight was a small cut, barely noticeable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of exclusion that wore away at my spirit. I found myself retreating further into solitude, afraid to ask for inclusion or to claim my place, convinced that I was more trouble than I was worth. Yet beneath the quiet resignation, a stubborn ember of defiance began to glow. I was not ready to vanish completely, not ready to be forgotten like an old photograph shoved into a drawer, so I started to rebuild, slowly and cautiously. I found a small apartment not far from the assisted living facility, a modest space with a window that let in morning light, and a kitchen where I could make tea and bake small batches of cookies. It was not the grand home I had once known, but it was mine, a place where I could begin to reclaim my identity outside the shadow of neglect. I enrolled in a local community center where classes and social events offered a chance to meet new people and rebuild a sense of belonging. The days were sometimes lonely, but they were also filled with quiet victories. A friendly smile from a neighbor, a successful recipe, a new friendship that did not demand anything but offered kindness in return. I started walking again, the stiff joints and aching muscles reminding me that my body bore the marks of time and hardship, but also that I was still here, still moving forward. Each step was a small act of rebellion against the erasure I had endured. I learned to say no to the guilt that tried to creep in, to reject the idea that my worth was tied solely to the service I had once provided to others. I was more than a caretaker, more than a mother or grandmother who had sacrificed so much. I was a woman with my own needs, desires, and dreams, even if they were quieter and simpler than those of my youth. And yet, the ghosts of the past lingered, manifesting in moments of doubt and fear. I worried that my daughter's rejection was permanent, that the damage could never be undone. I wondered if I was foolish to hope for reconciliation, or if that hope was a trap that would only lead to more pain. Letters I tried to write often went unsent, the words caught in my throat like a knot too tight to unravel. Phone calls were left unanswered, and visits never came. The silence was deafening, but in the stillness, I found space to listen to my own voice again, to hear the thoughts and feelings that had been buried under years of neglect and dismissal. I started to write, not letters to those who had hurt me, but journals for myself, where I could pour out the pain and the hope, the anger and the longing, without fear of judgment or rejection. Writing became a lifeline, a way to stitch together the fragments of a self that had been shattered. I discovered that I was not alone in my experience. In conversations with other women at the community center, I heard stories of betrayal and resilience that echoed my own. We shared tears and laughter, finding strength in our shared humanity and in the knowledge that even in the darkest times, we could find light. Slowly, the first escalation of my journey away from isolation and toward healing took shape not in grand gestures, but in these small, quiet acts of self-care and self-discovery. I learned to stand firm in my own truth, to set boundaries where none had existed before, and to say enough when the old patterns tried to pull me back. I began to see that my worth was not defined by others' acceptance or rejection, but by the simple fact that I existed, that I had survived, and that I still had dreams worth pursuing. The road was long and winding, filled with setbacks and moments of despair, but each day brought a little more clarity, a little more peace. The basement, the silence, the cold, they were chapters in my story, not the whole story. I was writing a new one now, with a steady hand and a hopeful heart, a story of resilience, of reclaiming, and of quiet but undeniable strength. It was the first step toward a life where I could finally belong. To myself. The turning point did not arrive as a thunderclap or a sudden revelation, but rather as a gentle unfolding, a slow dawn breaking after a long dark night. It was in the quiet moments, the small choices I began to make for myself, that I felt the first stirrings of something new, a shift from victim to survivor, from silence to voice. After the harshness of the basement and the painful distance from my family, I found myself standing at a crossroads, faced with the challenge of rebuilding a life that felt both unfamiliar and uncertain. The first spark of that change came unexpectedly, on a chilly morning when I decided to take a walk without a destination, just to feel the air on my face and the earth beneath my feet. The city around me was bustling, indifferent to my presence, but I welcomed the anonymity. For the first time in months, I was not hidden away or judged. I was simply a woman moving through the world on her own terms. As I wandered through the streets, I passed a small community center, its doors open and inviting. On a whim, I stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of a room filled with sunlight and the murmur of conversation. There, I found an unexpected sanctuary, a place where age was not a limitation, but a shared experience, where stories were exchanged and friendships blossomed like fragile flowers in spring. I signed up for a pottery class, my hands awkward at first, shaping clay that felt cold and alive beneath my fingers. The work was difficult but grounding, a tangible reminder that I could still create something beautiful from nothing. In those moments, I began to reclaim not just my hands, but my spirit, learning to mold my own future one small piece at a time. The relationships I formed in that space were unlike any I had known before. There were women who had weathered storms similar to mine, lost children, broken marriages, forgotten birthdays, and yet they carried a quiet strength that inspired me. We laughed at our shared foibles, cried over our hidden sorrows, and celebrated each small victory as if it were a triumph over the darkness itself. I realized that I was not alone in my pain or my resilience, that there was a community waiting to embrace me if I only had the courage to reach out. This newfound connection sparked a subtle but profound shift in my self-perception. I began to see myself not as a passive recipient of neglect, but as an active participant in my own healing. I started to set boundaries with my family, gently but firmly asserting my needs and refusing to be dismissed or silenced. I told my daughter, with as much kindness and clarity as I could muster, that I would no longer accept being hidden away or treated as an inconvenience. The conversations were difficult, filled with tension and unspoken grief, but they were necessary. I could not change the past, but I could shape the future by standing up for myself in the present. In this process, I discovered the power of choice. Each day, I made decisions that affirmed my worth and nurtured my independence, choosing what to eat, where to go, and whom to spend time with. I embraced the freedom to say no to requests that drained me and yes to opportunities that enriched my soul. Slowly, I shed the weight of guilt and obligation that had bound me for so long, learning to care for myself with the same tenderness I had once reserved for others. The transformation was not without setbacks. There were days when the loneliness returned, when memories of the basement's cold walls threatened to engulf me once more. I struggled with moments of doubt, wondering if I was strong enough to carry on, if the family I had lost would ever find a way back to me. But each time I faltered, I found support in my new community and within myself, drawing strength from the knowledge that I had already survived the darkest night. One symbolic moment stands out in my memory: the day I bought a coat for myself. It was not new or expensive, just a simple wool coat in a deep navy blue with pockets large enough to carry small treasures. I tried it on in a second-hand shop, feeling the fabric wrap around me like a promise. When I paid in cash, the young woman at the counter smiled and said, "You look sharp." I smiled back, feeling a surge of pride I hadn't known in years. It was more than just clothing. It was a declaration that I still mattered, that I still had the right to choose for myself. Wearing that coat, I walked through the neighborhood with my head held a little higher, feeling the warmth of the fabric and the sun on my face. It was a small but powerful act of reclaiming my identity, a step toward the life I was building on my own terms. The days that followed were filled with quiet routines and new rhythms. I worked part-time at a local cafe where I poured coffee and served customers with a steady hand and a calm heart. The work was honest and grounding, a way to connect with the world beyond my own walls. I found joy in the simple exchanges: a smile, a thank you, a shared story over the morning rush. Through these experiences, I began to understand that healing was not a destination, but a journey, one that required patience, courage, and self-compassion. I learned to listen to my own needs and honor my own feelings, even when they conflicted with the expectations of others. This shift was not about forgetting the past or excusing the pain, but about choosing to move forward despite it. I began to see the basement not as a tomb, but as a threshold, a dark passage that I had crossed, emerging on the other side with a clearer sense of who I was and who I wanted to be. The fear and sadness remained, but no longer controlled me. I was no longer a prisoner of neglect, but a woman in charge of her own story, writing new chapters filled with possibility and grace. This was the turning point where I stopped waiting for others to save me and started saving myself. It was the moment I realized that I was worthy of love, respect, and freedom, not because of what I had done for others, but because I simply existed. And with that realization came the quiet, steady hope that even after the darkest nights, the dawn always comes. Just when I thought the dust was settling, that the fragile new life I was painstakingly building might finally take root and grow, the past came rushing back with a force I had not anticipated, shaking the foundations of everything I had tried to create. It was as if the walls I had climbed so carefully over began to crumble, and the voices I thought I had silenced found their way back in through cracks I hadn't noticed. The second escalation of my journey was marked not by grand confrontations, but by subtle, insidious reminders that the ties to my former life were not so easily severed, that the family I had been pushed away from was not ready to let me go without a fight. It started with a letter, thin and unassuming in its envelope, slipped quietly under my door one chilly morning. The handwriting was familiar, but the words inside carried a weight I was not prepared for. My grandson, Kieran, had written to me. The letter was brief, filled with a mixture of worry, longing, and tentative hope. He spoke of how much he missed me, how my absence had left a hole in his days, and how his parents were frantic with concern. But there was no pressure, no demand for explanations or apologies, just the simple expression of a boy who still held on to the memory of a grandmother's love. Reading those words, I felt a flicker of warmth and a pang of sorrow. Kieran was the one person in that fractured family who had never turned his back on me, the one who had called just to hear my voice, who had shown up unbidden to remind me that I mattered. But even as I cherished his letter, I hesitated to reply. The wounds were still fresh, the memories too raw, and the fear of being drawn back into the cycle of neglect and disappointment held me back. Days passed, and then a visit came that unsettled the delicate balance I had found. It was my daughter Lisa, appearing unexpectedly at the cafe where I worked, her presence a storm cloud darkening a sunny morning. She stood by the pastry display, her coat pulled tight against the chill, her expression unreadable and tense. I saw the flicker of surprise on Heather's face when she noticed Lisa, but I said nothing, letting the silence stretch between us like a taut wire. When Lisa finally approached, her voice was low, almost tentative, as she asked, "Can we talk?" I nodded toward the back booth, the place where I had learned to carry plates and pour coffee with steady hands, and we sat opposite each other in a space that suddenly felt too small to hold the weight of years. She began with apologies, half-hearted, stumbling, filled with excuses about how overwhelmed they had been, how the children needed so much attention, how it had never been their intention to hurt me. But I saw through the veneer of regret, the carefully crafted story that sought to smooth over the cracks with words, but not with actions. I reminded her gently but firmly of the night in the basement, of the hours spent alone in the cold and dark, and of the silence that had swallowed my cries for help. She flinched, but did not deny it. Instead, she spoke of fear of the responsibility, fear of the judgment of others, fear of being overwhelmed. It was a confession as much as an excuse, and I listened with a mixture of sadness and understanding. That conversation was the first of many difficult exchanges, each one a negotiation of boundaries and broken trust. My daughter and son-in-law enlisted a lawyer, a man whose polished suit and careful words seemed designed to control the narrative and protect their image more than to mend the family wounds. Letters from him arrived regularly, filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats disguised as concern. They wanted me to agree to assessments, to relocate to a facility they deemed more appropriate, to relinquish control over my finances and decisions. I read those letters with a cold clarity, recognizing that this was not about my well-being, but about regaining control and silencing a voice they found inconvenient. The community around me buzzed with whispers. Neighbors who once nodded kindly now looked away or spoke in hushed tones. The story of the missing grandmother and the family dispute became a topic of gossip and speculation, painting me as a fragile, vulnerable woman in need of saving. The local newspaper even published an article quoting my son and daughter-in-law, expressing their worry and pleading for my safe return. I kept the clipping, not out of pride, but as proof that concern often masks control, that love can be wielded as a weapon, and that the performance of care sometimes hides a desire to erase the inconvenient truth. Yet amid this storm, unexpected kindness emerged. Arthur, a widower who had become a regular at the cafe, offered steady companionship without demands or questions. His quiet presence was a balm, a reminder that connection could be gentle and unpressured. Joyce, my landlady and reluctant friend, provided a sense of stability and home that no family had offered in years. These new relationships, forged in the aftermath of betrayal, became lifelines, anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Despite the pressures and the public scrutiny, I began to claim my own narrative. I refused to be cast as a helpless victim or a forgotten relic. I spoke out at community meetings, shared my story with neighbors willing to listen, and asserted my right to live with dignity and independence. The legal battles and family interventions tested my resolve, but they also strengthened it. Each time they tried to impose their will, I stood firmer, drawing on reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed. The second escalation was a crucible, burning away illusions and forcing me to confront the reality of broken relationships and lingering wounds. It was a time of fear and anger, of heartbreak and determination. But through it all, I discovered that resilience is not the absence of pain, but the courage to endure it and keep moving forward. I learned that healing does not mean forgetting, but rather reclaiming one's own story from the fragments others try to dictate. As the storm raged around me, I found peace not in reconciliation, but in acceptance of my past, my losses, and my right to choose my own path. The journey was far from over, but the fire had been lit, and I was ready to face whatever came next with a steady heart and an unyielding spirit. The moment of climax was not marked by a grand showdown or a public declaration, but by a quiet, resolute act that severed the last threads, tying me to a life that had become unbearable and hollow. It was the culmination of months, perhaps years, of sorrow, neglect, and a deepening resolve to reclaim my dignity on my own terms. After the relentless push and pull with my family, the visits fraught with unspoken accusations, the legal letters that disguised control as concern, the public spectacle that painted me as fragile and vulnerable, I realized that the only way to truly be free was to draw a firm line, to say no more, and to step fully into the power of my own voice. The catalyst for this final act came on a rainy afternoon when I sat at the kitchen table in my small apartment, the one place in the world I could call my own. The rain tapped softly against the window pane, a steady rhythm that mirrored the quiet determination building inside me. Before me lay a letter I had written with careful hand, words not born of anger, but of clarity and finality. It was addressed not to my family, but to their lawyer, a man who had become an unwelcome but persistent figure in my life. The letter was brief yet unambiguous. I was of sound mind and safe environment. I refused any further contact unless under my own conditions. Any attempts to coerce or harass would be met with legal action. Signing it felt like releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding for so long. That night, I sent the letter with steady hands, aware that this was more than paper and ink. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to be silenced or controlled any longer. But my act of reclaiming agency did not stop there. I also wrote a short letter to my daughter, Lisa, not filled with accusations or bitterness, but a clear message that the past was behind me and that I was choosing a new path, one that did not include returning to the roles they had assigned me. The words were few but potent. I was not angry. I was not coming back, and they needed to take care of their own lives now. Mailing that letter felt like closing a door with finality, but it also opened a window to a future I was determined to shape. In the days that followed, the silence from my family was profound but no longer painful. I had stopped waiting for apologies or invitations to return. Instead, I focused on the life I was building: work at the cafe, new friendships, small pleasures that stitched my days together with threads of hope. When Lisa unexpectedly appeared at the cafe weeks later, I did not run or hide, but neither did I invite reconciliation. She came stiff and cautious, a woman weighed down by her own fears and regrets. We spoke quietly, honestly. She admitted the panic and guilt that had driven her actions, the fear of losing control, the difficulty of facing a mother who was no longer willing to be invisible. I listened, but I did not retreat. I told her I was no longer a shadow in her life, but a woman who had learned to stand in her own light. The conversation ended not with promises, but with an understanding that some distances cannot be crossed all at once. It was a beginning, but only if each of us was willing to keep walking. Meanwhile, legal representatives came and went, but I held firm to my boundaries, supported by local counsel who respected my autonomy and strength. Every attempt to sway me was met with the same quiet resolve. I was no longer the woman who would be bullied into submission or guilted into silence. I was the woman who had survived darkness and chosen to live fully, fiercely, on her own terms. This climax was not a dramatic confrontation, but a series of small, unwavering choices. To say no when pressured, to say yes to myself, to reject the narrative others tried to impose, and to write my own story with courage and grace. It was the moment I finally understood that power does not always roar. Sometimes it is the steady flame that refuses to be extinguished. Sitting in my kitchen, watching the rain turn to a soft mist, I felt a profound sense of peace. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was not afraid. I had reclaimed my voice, my body, and my life. I was whole again, not because others had restored me, but because I had chosen to be restored by myself. And that choice, that quiet, resolute act, was the greatest victory of all. The quiet that settled after the storm was unlike any I had known before, not the silence of neglect or abandonment, but a stillness born of acceptance and hard-won peace. It was in this calm that I found the true meaning of freedom, not as a distant dream, but as a daily, living reality. In the weeks and months following the climax of my journey, I settled into rhythms that felt steady and real. Mornings began with sunlight pouring through the window, casting gentle patterns on the worn floorboards of my small apartment. I brewed tea in my favorite chipped mug, the aroma a comforting thread linking past and present. I would sit by the window, watching the world awaken, birds fluttering, leaves trembling in the breeze, neighbors greeting one another with familiar smiles, and feel a quiet joy in simply being part of this unfolding life. The connections I had made flourished gently. Arthur came by regularly, his presence a steady comfort, a reminder that companionship need not demand, but could simply be offered and accepted. Joyce, with her sharp wit and warm heart, remained a steadfast friend, a witness to my transformation from shadow to woman. Together, they formed a small circle of belonging that I had once believed was beyond my reach. My relationship with Kieran, my grandson, grew into a tender bridge spanning the chasm left by years of silence and hurt. When he came to visit, we spoke honestly and without pretense, sharing stories and laughter that patched old wounds with threads of hope. He never pressured me for explanations or apologies. Instead, he offered presence and understanding, the most precious gifts of all. With each visit, I felt the walls I had built around my heart soften, allowing love to flow in gentle streams rather than crashing waves. And yet, I knew that the past was not something to be erased or forgotten, but carried with me as a part of my story. I did not seek revenge or resentment. Those emotions were too heavy to bear. Instead, I chose forgiveness, not for their sake, but for my own, a release from the chains that bound me to pain. This forgiveness was not a sudden absolution, but a gradual unfolding, a slow loosening of the grip grief and anger had held. It was in this space that I found the strength to write a letter to myself, a letter filled with compassion and affirmation. In it, I told myself that I had waited too long for salvation from others and had forgotten that I was the one holding the key all along. I reminded myself that I had not lost them, but that they had let go, and that I had finally let go in return. The letter was a gift, a talisman I kept tucked away in my dresser drawer, a reminder of the journey from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. Life, I came to understand, is not about grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but about the small, steady acts of choosing oneself every day. It is about the courage to stand in the light even when shadows linger, about the grace to accept what cannot be changed while shaping what still can. In the stillness of my quiet apartment, with Franklin purring softly on my lap and the scent of lemon squares baking in the oven, I felt a profound sense of belonging to myself, to the world, and to the life I was building with my own hands. If this story finds you in a moment of doubt or despair, know that it is never too late to choose yourself, to be your own sign in the silence, your own step away from the dark rooms that confine you. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, waiting with open arms and a listening heart, because in choosing yourself, you do not walk alone. You join a chorus of voices that have risen from fire and forgetting, a symphony of women who have reclaimed their power and their peace. And that is the most beautiful song of all.